You might know someone your entire life, only to find out they're a total stranger. This couldn't ring truer for the relationship between my brother and me. Hi, my name's Ryan, and this is a story of my older brother, Scott, and me, mainly about how harmless rivalry can culminate into something disastrous. It always shocks me when I think about how Scott developed into the person he is today. But I suppose there were always signs. Born 5 years after Scott, I was undeniably the more pampered child. It often happens that the older child is neglected in favor of the younger one, and unfortunately, mine is a case taken to the extreme. While I was never for sibling favoritism, my parents doted a bit much on me, which is why I suppose everything in the future unfolded the way it did. It was never like this from the beginning, though. Scott in my childhood remains a beautiful memory full of warmth and laughter, where we loved each other's company. Our parents even described us as inseparable. Growing up, I remember how we'd pull out our big box of wooden blocks and scatter them across the living room. Scott, being older, would show me how to build tall towers and castles. I recall how we'd dress up as knights, complete with our cardboard swords and makeshift armor. It's heartbreaking to reflect on such memories when I know what our future holds. While childhood was blissful, the real trouble emerged when Scott and I were in middle school. To be honest, Scott had never been too academically inclined and was always a bit lazy. This was never a problem until I joined middle school later. This was when the comparisons started to pile on against my best wishes. Initially, there wasn't any friction at all. Scott, being the older child, already had a social circle and would look after me at school. We'd head home together and talk about our day. However, one unexpected day at school suddenly threatened our sibling bond. It marked the slow decline of our relationship. On an unassuming Monday, my math teacher was handing out results from the previous week's test. I was overjoyed to learn that I'd scored an A+ and couldn't wait to share the news with Scott and my parents. Unlike Scott, I leaned toward academics while he was obsessed with sports. He wasn't the most exceptional player, but he was super knowledgeable about it. I took up after my father. I loved numbers and calculations and always hoped to become a businessman like him someday. My parents would keep passing remarks about Scott's low grades and urge him to do better, but Scott would brush them off completely. For him, sports was all that mattered, which is why the events of that day changed everything. Scott had just been recovering from a leg injury, and only a week after he'd healed, he signed up for basketball tryouts. The tryouts were scheduled for the same day I scored an A on my math test. I returned home early from school, while Scott stayed behind for his tryouts. I shared the news of my test with my parents, who were extremely happy. Unfortunately, the timing couldn't have been worse when Scott entered home later with a gloomy face. All of us were gathered in the living room, and I vividly remember this being our first fight. My father glared at Scott, ready with a disapproving look. "How'd it go?" "Not bad. The coach didn't seem too pleased, so we'll have to wait and watch tomorrow." "Scott, does that mean a yes or a no?" "I'll have to wait till tomorrow, Dad." His voice cracked, revealing a fearfulness. "Not bad, so you probably won't make the cut, then?" "Dad, we'll just have to wait and watch." "Enough of this nonsense, Scott. You've been giving tryouts for 3 years now, and you're nowhere close to any team. This has got to stop." "Dad, let's just wait till tomorrow. Coach might change his mind, and I'm tired of excuses, Scott. Ryan scored an A+ today in his math test, and he's 5 years younger. 5 years and you've never scored an A+. I don't even know what to say to you." Scott furiously marched back to his bedroom and slammed the door shut as my parents ignored his outburst. However, this one emotionally charged conversation changed the atmosphere among us forever. Things were never the same again after the following day when Scott didn't make the cut for the basketball team. His happy-go-lucky attitude was slowly erased by the burden of my parents' expectations. I hated the random comparisons since I knew academics wasn't Scott's thing and he probably had other ambitions. But each time I argued with my parents over the comparisons, they'd only shout back at me. "Dad, I think you're being too harsh on Scott." "Well, I'm right, aren't I? He needs to learn, Ryan. He needs to do better with his life." "But he's good at sports. He can do something with that." "He's failed tryouts for 3 years now. He's just not good, and he needs to admit that and move on to bigger things. Maybe open a textbook for once in his life and work hard like you do." In a rather dramatic twist, Scott emerged from his bedroom and confessed that he'd heard everything. I felt my heart sink in my chest that he had to hear all of that, but it was made worse by what my father said next. "Was I wrong about any of that, Scott? What are your aims in life anyway?" Scott's face fell in a way I'd never seen before, and he retreated to his bedroom. It was clear that after his failed tryout attempt, my parents had gotten stricter and more controlling with him. In the weeks and months that followed, things got worse. Back at school, most of Scott's friends had made the cut for the basketball team, leaving him alone and alienated. When I'd try to approach him during lunch breaks, he'd walk past me with a cold nod, as though he didn't know me. The tension was starting to affect me quite a bit, and I suppose this was the time that laid the foundation for all future events. Once I even witnessed him being bullied near his locker. "Man, Scott, you thought you were an all-star player, huh?" He thinks he's the next LeBron but couldn't even dribble right during middle school tryouts. The small group of 4 bullies burst out laughing as I tried to intervene. "Hey, quit bothering my brother." To make matters worse, the bullies laughed even more and walked away, but shouted across the halls. Of course, the little princess needs his knight in shining armor to save him. However, instead of feeling relieved, this incident only irked Scott further. He pushed me away and yelled, "I don't need you to defend me, just back off." I felt crushed by my brother's reaction. All I wanted was to stand up for him and support him from the people who were consistently putting him down. But Scott continued to distance himself from both me and the people at school. It appeared that he'd pinned all his hopes onto making the basketball team, but now that he hadn't, he was slowly withdrawing into a shell. I tried to get Scott to open up and share his troubles with me, but every attempt was met by a cold shoulder. It seemed like anything we tried to do together, whether it was teaching him math or science, only invited comparisons and criticisms. Over time, his cold behavior turned into rudeness and resentment. Around this time, my father had just opened up his first ever factory to expand his business. The factory opening was a grand event, with guests from all over town. It was a moment of great joy and celebration for us, for most of us at least. For Scott, bitterness had seeped in so deeply that he refused to participate in family events. During the factory opening, he even chose to stay at home. He just wasn't the same any longer, and there came a time when things finally exploded. During my annual science fair, I'd been working hard on a wind turbine model with my father, while Scott became more distant than ever from us. His grades were nosediving, and he was being bullied constantly. This was also the time when I first met Amanda, the girl who would change my life forever. Meeting her felt like a breath of fresh air. Amanda's presence would later become a beacon of hope and change. She was intelligent, witty, and beautiful. She had an older brother, Justin, whom she was quite close to. Sadly, the wonderful bond they shared only made me miserable about the lost sibling friendship between Scott and me. Amanda and I bumped into each other since our lockers were together, and one conversation led to another. At a time when the distance between my brother and me grew, Amanda felt like a solace. But her presence didn't mean that I'd given up on Scott. I continued making efforts to spend time with him, suggesting movies, arcades, or anything he wanted, but after a certain point, Scott just became too resentful. He spewed insults and acted bitter with my parents as well. A slow pattern of jealousy started to form, which would come to a head during the science fair. I was finishing work on my wind turbine model while also helping Amanda with her project based on aquatic life. I even introduced her to my parents, who welcomed her warmly. They invited Amanda over for a family dinner once, where things unfortunately escalated to a startling degree. During the dinner, my parents were all praises for Amanda and me. "I'm so blessed that my incredible son has found an incredible friend like Amanda. May God bless you both." "So Amanda, Ryan tells me that you're working on an aquatic-based project." "That's right. I'm researching bioluminescence in marine organisms." "That sounds incredible. One of my cousins is a marine biologist. He could help you out. Honestly, we've got so much talent in the family. Feels like it runs in the genes." My father glanced at Scott, and his expression changed immediately. Well, maybe not for everyone. There was mild laughter, but Scott's scornful look said it all. He smashed his dinner plate against the floor and marched back to his bedroom. My parents almost started a screaming match, but controlled themselves in Amanda's presence. Frankly, she was shocked to witness this too, but the real horror would arrive in a week. As I finished up work on my wind turbine, I left it unattended in my bedroom while I was over at Amanda's place to help her finish her project. It was the day before the science fair. When I returned home, the project was still intact, and as I went to sleep that night, I was oblivious to what awaited me the next morning. On the day of the science fair, I woke up enthusiastically but was shocked to see my wind turbine missing. I frantically rushed downstairs and alerted my parents, who were as desperate to find it. Scott stepped out of his room but looked unbothered. Finally, my mother yelled from outside. "Oh my God." All of us rushed outside to find the wind turbine smashed to pieces and dumped hastily in the trash can. I was devastated by the sight of it, unable to imagine all my hard work gone literally in the trash. Suddenly, Scott chuckled, to which all of us glared at him, and he stared at my father unfazed and announced, "I think being trash runs in Ryan's genes. Your incredible son isn't so great anymore, huh?" I was stunned. I couldn't believe Scott was responsible for this. My father beat him severely and I shouted at him, but Scott simply didn't care. He'd done it out of sheer jealousy and spite, and this incident paled in comparison to what he'd end up doing in the future. He accepted the blame for the incident, and despite my repeated pleas to sort things out, he refused. A divide had now been set in stone between the two of us. The science fair remains a bittersweet memory, because my project had been destroyed but Amanda came in second place at the fair, a feat which my parents and I eagerly celebrated. Amid this tumultuous time with Scott, being with Amanda gave me all the joy in the world. But even the greatest things rarely last. A few months later, it felt as though my life had come crashing down after a surprise announcement from Amanda. For some reason, she'd been acting strange at school for a week. She was frequently nervous and acted cold towards me. I never understood why despite questioning her dozens of times. However, the real reason blindsided me on an unsuspecting Tuesday. I still remember how heartbroken that day had left me. When I entered the classroom that day, I noticed Amanda sitting silently, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. I approached her calmly, but her attitude remained cold and detached. Fearing something had happened, I tried to make amends and talk it out after class, when I learned the truth from her. "Amanda, just tell me what happened. You've been acting so distant that I'm losing my mind." "I don't know what to tell you, Ryan. I really don't. If something's bothering you, you can just be honest. We can fix it, we can." "I'm moving away, Ryan." There, I said it. I remember exactly how devastated and surprised I felt at that moment. Amanda's eyes welled up with tears and she then explained that it was a hasty decision made by her parents since her father had to move town due to his work. They wouldn't be returning anytime soon. I was heartbroken by the news and wondered what would happen now. It sounds cliché, but Amanda truly was like a ray of sunshine in my life, and her absence meant I'd be all alone, right back to square one. I bid her goodbye after school and she gave me a tight hug, assuring me she'd be back. I clearly remember holding her hand during that moment and noticing something that would be etched in my memory forever. Of course, it wouldn't be relevant until several years down the line. As Amanda moved away, life became dreary again and school was much harder. She'd been an emotional anchor and my only friend, but now I was all alone with a brother who resented me. Months and eventually years flew by as I continued to work hard at academics while my relationship with Scott diminished. We rarely talked to each other anymore. I passed through middle school as well as high school with consistently high grades, whereas Scott struggled and failed. High school basketball tryouts as well. I felt terrible for him, but he'd adopted a bullying attitude towards me whenever I tried to make conversation. Despite Scott and my strained relationship, I'd complain to my parents about their harsh treatment of him, but they'd dismiss me and say that I shouldn't bother. All this resentment and tension is what ultimately paved the way for the shocking future. Once we were older, both Scott and I were sent to the same business college to educate ourselves and learn the ropes so we could take over our father's factory. Given Scott's constant failings at sports and his general aimlessness, my father forced him to attend the business college in hopes of straightening him out. Scott tried his best to work hard and learn tricks of the trade, but whether it was academics or practical knowledge, Scott seemed least interested. He failed yet again and begged to drop out of college, to which my father eventually obliged. I worked hard throughout college, loving the environment there, while our father gave Scott a final chance to prove himself in sports and decided to send him to a D3 college in another state. It was a last-ditch attempt to allow Scott to find something he could excel at. With Scott being allowed to pursue his ambition, I finally hoped for reconciliation for our family again. But only 3 months later, on the cusp of my graduation, we received a startling call in the middle of the night. My father answered it, and all of us were horrified by the news we received. It turned out that Scott had been partying out of control at a frat party and had gotten into an argument with a member and smashed his head with a bottle. One of the members had provoked him and called out his sports ability, stating that he'd only gotten in through money. As a response, Scott smashed a bottle on his head and the boy landed up in the ER. Scott was now expelled as he'd injured 2 other students as well under the influence of alcohol. We couldn't believe Scott was capable of something like this. My parents, gravely disappointed, accepted his rustication and took Scott back home. My father ordered him to start working in the factory immediately without any protest. I felt shattered by his fate. He'd been given every chance to prove himself, and it was unfortunate that he landed up in such a situation. Disinterested and demotivated, Scott was forced by our father to follow the floor manager around the factory and learn the business. I graduated a month later with top honors and was truly overwhelmed. My parents and Scott attended the ceremony, but it was clear that Scott wished he was anywhere else at that moment. Sometimes, I felt stupid for caring so deeply for my brother who would go on to inflict nothing but pain upon me in the future. Now a successful graduate, my father asked me to shadow him around the factory and sit in on shareholder meetings and calls with clients. It was fascinating to learn the breadth of the factory's operations and a chance to see how it all played out. I worked diligently for 7 years, spending 2 years handling a small client's business to grasp the basics, and spent the rest of the 5 years shadowing my father. During this time, Scott worked under the floor manager for a little over a year before quitting. He'd spent the last 6 years cashing in our father's checks and trying to establish a sports academy. I'd repeatedly warned him about his poor business model and volunteered to help him out, but he warned me not to interfere. However, 7 years later, there was a series of events that left us all with emotional whiplash. My father called in sick and left me in charge of the factory for the day. As I was wrapping up a meeting with the board, I received a terrifying phone call from our mother. "Ryan, where are you?" "Mom, I'm at the factory. What's the matter?" "Ryan, you need to come home right now. It's your dad. He's not breathing." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. It's as though my whole world had stopped. I rushed to the hospital where my father was being treated. He'd suffered a heart attack and needed bypass surgery, which we authorized. Scott was busy and couldn't make it until the next day. I stayed with my mother, both of us praying for a miracle, and a miracle indeed occurred. My father was awake after a successful surgery and Scott arrived late that evening, just an hour before his discharge. I felt disgusted looking at him. He reeked of alcohol and had bloodshot eyes. "Where were you, Scott?" "Just quit bothering me, Mom. I was busy, all right? Is he okay?" "The doctors said he made it. It was a successful surgery." Well, that's good, I suppose." As our father was finally discharged, all of us accompanied him home. Despite the tensions with Scott, we all hoped to have a peaceful dinner with our father post-recovery. However, little did I know that this dinner would be the defining moment of my life. As all of us sat down quietly, my father smiled at me with a wide grin. "I have an announcement to make. Since all of us are finally gathered here again, you all must hear this. Ryan, you've been working dedicatedly for 7 years. I mean, just picking up things quickly, sitting for board meetings, you're a natural-born genius." Scott shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and it felt like we were 12 again. I was curious about where our father was going with this. "What I'm saying is, it's time, Ryan." "For what, Dad?" "The keys to the kingdom are yours now. The factory belongs to you now." "Dad, you can't be serious." "But I am. God knows you've earned it. I'm getting old and tired." "Now, Ryan, I can't keep looking after it forever. Anyway, it was going to be yours all along." "But I'm the eldest son. I'm the eldest son, Dad." "Well, I guess if you acted like one, things would be so much more different today, wouldn't they?" Scott angrily left the table and stormed out of the house. My father ignored him and instead congratulated me. It felt both overwhelming and jarring. I was only 30 and was about to undertake the responsibility of an entire factory. It was incredibly daunting, but I suppose I had to step up to the challenge and fulfill my father's legacy. After a legal and financial review of the factory with my father, we finally executed the transfer of ownership over to me. My father effectively announced his retirement, and the shareholders, who'd witnessed my commitment over 7 years, welcomed my leadership with open arms. I had no idea, however, that what would follow next would be the most devastating 2 years of my life. Everything was about to disappear in an instant. A few months after I took over the factory, a natural disaster struck our supplier's factory and disrupted our supply chain overnight. Our shipments and production were delayed for weeks. I had a conversation with our CFO about the next steps, but I was in for a greater shock as he revealed some of the company's steep debts to me. I spent many sleepless nights wondering about the burden that had now been passed onto my shoulders, but I had to lead the company even under pressure. As I tried figuring out alternative suppliers over the next few days, Scott paid me an abrupt visit. It was the first time I'd seen him since the family dinner, and I was curious about what he wanted. Scott explained that he had a few friends of friends who could help secure our raw materials and asked me to trust him. Already in a volatile position and eager about my brother's return, I decided to trust him blindly. Scott started working at the factory again as an extra floor manager, a position I helped set up for him. I had no idea what was going on with his sports academy, but it was clear he needed my help and I offered it to him. However, I was met with a rude shock only a week later. A board meeting at the factory had concluded much earlier than expected, and I wandered onto the factory floor to monitor the production. That's when I noticed Scott gathering the workers and giving impassioned speeches to them. Your boss, the great Ryan, sits up in his office and reaps the benefits of your labor. Production has suffered, and you've all accepted pay cuts, but trust me, it hasn't affected his life one bit. We need to take a stand. Hey, what's going on here? The other workers started to disperse, but I urged everyone to wait. I couldn't believe it. After all this time, Scott hadn't changed one bit. In one of the lowest times for the company, I'd turned to him for help and support, only for him to pull a stunt like this. The fact that he was exploiting the existing tensions in the factory to his advantage was downright pathetic. What was I thinking? Here I trusted him to help save the company, and he was sowing seeds of dissent and sabotaging me instead. I fired Scott immediately and asked him never to return. I publicly denounced him and urged my father to cut all the hefty checks he'd been sending Scott. That money came significantly out of the company's profits, and given the stunt he'd just pulled, I decided he couldn't reap the benefits anymore. After cutting Scott's checks, I forwent my salary too for a few months to ensure the workers were paid on time. What sort of a leader would I be if I couldn't sacrifice for them in times of crisis? What's worse is that only a few months later, as the factory started to stabilize once again, I discovered another scheme Scott had been cooking up. I learned through shareholders that Scott, who had shares in the company, was planning to persuade other shareholders, our family friends, to sell him shares so he could gain majority control of the factory. The shareholders, who had always been loyal to my father, alerted me about this scheme, and I shut it down immediately. I confronted Scott and threatened legal action if he were to ever meddle with the factory again. I had no clue, however, that the very worst was yet to come. A few months later, as we focused on a massive factory shipment, I had an unexpected visitor. Things had gone by peacefully, and I was worried whether it was Scott again, but to my surprise, it was a complete stranger waiting in my office. He had an appointment with me. Hello, how can I help you? My name's Kevin, thank you for meeting me. It's a pleasure. So, what's this about, Kevin? This is about fire hazards, sir. I was a fire safety inspector earlier and consider it my duty to provide the best facilities to the best companies. That's interesting, Kevin, but we're not looking for fire equipment. We have a pretty competent system in place already. Well, I spoke to some people downstairs and they've all told me that the equipment's really outdated. I even chatted about it with some of the people on this floor. You spoke to the shareholders about this. Why on earth would you do that? Fire safety is no joke, sir. You need to have the best and most sophisticated system. It's essential. Listen, I don't have time for this. Our system is just fine, and I'm not buying some fancy tech with a heavy price tag. Understood. Thank you for your time, sir. Kevin exited the room without another word, but if only I'd known who he was and what he was up to, I would have stopped him there and then. Part of me regrets not having acted sooner, but the other part believes the future would have happened anyway. The news of the fire system spread across the floor, but I announced that I'd look into the matter within the week. If only I'd done something. The regret still haunts me. 2 days later, the worst tragedy possible struck the factory. Most of us had left for the night and headed home. There were still a few workers overseeing production at the factory. The memory of it never left my mind. I was fast asleep in my own apartment and received a phone call around 3 a.m. It was from the police, followed by the fire department. The factory had caught fire and burned down. I felt an overwhelming sense of panic and worry as I called my parents to let them know and rushed to the scene. However, by the time I arrived at the site, it was too late. The factory was gone. The entire neighborhood had gathered at the site, along with hordes of police and firemen. Despite the excessive number of people present, there was nothing we could do. I still recall the crushing and devastating feeling when I first laid eyes on the fire and saw charred bodies being taken out. One of the officials then informed me of the tragic news that there'd been only one survivor in the fire while the rest had perished. I was shocked beyond belief. A million thoughts rushed through my head, mainly about the workers and their families. How could I ever answer them? As the fire was put out after several hours, the factory was no more. It was all gone. I kept blaming myself and my own foolishness for paying no heed to Kevin's warnings. Predictably so, the community's outlook had changed overnight as well. My father and I went from respectable business owners to despicable demons who let such a tragedy happen and ignored warnings from a fire inspector himself. What came next was utter chaos, and the legal and financial fallout was disastrous. Like a flip of the switch, the entire community had now condemned me and our business. An investigation was carried out by the fire department as well as the police. They concluded that the systems were perfectly competent but had malfunctioned very unexpectedly, resulting in the fire spreading throughout the factory. What followed were a series of civil lawsuits by families of the deceased workers as well as charges of negligence, since my ignorance of Kevin's warning was common knowledge. The factory's insurance company conducted its own investigation but denied compensation since I hadn't listened to Kevin. My mind was plagued by the man's name. I'd never known him in my life, and now suddenly he was the reason I was being blamed for everything. With the insurance claim being denied, we now faced immense financial strain. I sold my apartment and almost all of my assets, including my parents, to cover the legal and financial debts. We were, to put it simply, ruined and bankrupt. There was nowhere to go. The combination of legal fees, settlements, and the loss of income from the factory meant we lost nearly all assets and savings as well. All that was left was my parents' house, the one we'd grown up in. After our public, legal, and financial ruin, we were completely unemployed and broke. My father had suffered a stroke and was now bedridden, while my mother turned to me for hope. We didn't hear from Scott during this time. With our public reputation tarnished and with no hope for a steady career, I sought out all possible jobs until I was finally offered a cashier at a local restaurant. It deeply troubled me that I'd spent my entire life being a hardworking and diligent person only to end up here. I couldn't believe this was what it had all come to, but I had to. Accept whatever came my way, and so I did. I worked hard as a cashier and even heard the occasional customers talking about me and pointing fingers when they saw me. I let it all go, focusing on the job instead. This continued for a couple of months, and the meager pay I received was largely spent on our father's medical bills. But my entire life changed unimaginably after a surprise customer walked into the restaurant. I was busy at the cash register and didn't notice her until she arrived to pay her bill. There was a resemblance up close, but I wasn't sure. It was only when she handed me the money that I noticed a birthmark on her hand. It was unmistakable. It can't be Amanda. She took off her sunglasses and I couldn't stop smiling. It was indeed her. I recognized the birthmark instantly. I remember the day she left middle school and I held her hand. I never forgot the mark. "Do you remember me?" Amanda stared at me with a faint smile and leaned forward. She pointed outside the restaurant. "Ryan, I've been looking for you. Can you meet me outside?" I was puzzled. Here I was, shocked at her presence, but she'd been looking for me. "My shift's wrapping up in 10, I'll see you outside." We sat in Amanda's car in the parking lot, as she confessed the true reason she'd returned. She got teary-eyed as she spoke, and what she said next shattered me. "You remember my brother Justin, don't you?" "Of course. He came here looking for work last year. He worked in your factory in a junior position. He was a victim of the factory fire." I was broken by Amanda's revelation. The fact that one of the victims had been someone I'd known so fondly. It's as though my guilt intensified. "Amanda, I'm so sorry. I can't begin to apologize." "Ryan, you don't need to. I'm here to help you. You didn't do this. You were set up. Look at this." I grappled with Amanda's statement as she revealed photos and texts of a strange man. But a closer look at the photos left me shocked beyond belief. I had to double-check to make sure it was him. "Is that Kevin?" "It's him." I remember. He's a scam artist who's on the run. I was finally able to track him down. He lives 20 miles from here under a new name and identity. "Amanda, how did you find this out?" After Justin's death, I spoke to a couple of his co-workers who mentioned Kevin. There were reports about him in the press, but nobody was bothered. I did some thorough research and digging of my own until I found him. Amanda, that's incredible. We need to find him and confront him and... Well, fasten your seatbelt, we're visiting him right now. For the first time in ages, I felt this profound sense of exhilaration and nervousness. I'd spent endless nights blaming myself for the fire, only to realize that someone may have sabotaged me. But why? I was about to find out. Amanda and I drove to Kevin's home. It was an isolated property, and he didn't want anyone snooping around. We got out of the car and rang the doorbell. Kevin answered enthusiastically, and his face fell as soon as he saw me. He tried to shut the door, but Amanda and I barged him and forced him into a corner. We threatened him with a police tip-off until he complied with our demands. Once he'd calmed down and agreed, Kevin revealed something that left me dumbfounded. It was a revelation that simply changed everything I'd ever known. I'm sorry, Ryan. I didn't want to do this. Why did you do it? Who put you up to this? It was your brother, Scott. He paid me. I was just told to rig the systems. I had no idea there were people inside. That revelation made me feel as though my entire world was collapsing. It simply couldn't be. Everything I'd ever done for Scott, the sheer kindness I'd shown him each time. But I never expected him to reach such evil lengths in a jealous rage. How could he have done something like this? I stalled Kevin until Amanda called the cops to his residence so we could have him arrested. Meanwhile, Kevin confessed to me that Scott's academy had shut down years ago and he'd just been cashing in the checks for himself, totaling some $750,000. The factory fire and now this. Scott had simply used us over and over and had betrayed us at every turn. The cops arrived at the scene and Kevin tried to flee but was arrested. He didn't know where Scott was but had his phone number. I cooperated with the police and devised a plan. With Scott's number, I would speak to him on call long enough to trace his location. It was a risky move, but it was the only way to find him. I remember how nervous I was as I dialed the number at the precinct while Amanda and everyone else watched me, ready to trace the call. There was finally an answer. Hello? Who is this? How'd you get this number? Scott, it's me. It took a moment, but Scott understood who I was. Before he could hang up, I tried to extend the call. Don't hang up. Hear me out. Scott hesitated, and I could sense his surprise and hesitation through the phone. Ryan? What do you want? I know what you did, Scott. Kevin told me everything. Why did you do it? Why would you go to such lengths to destroy our lives? There was silence on the other end, a long, heavy pause. I could almost feel Scott's mind racing as he processed the fact that his secret was out. I'm not interested in this conversation. No, you need to tell me, Scott. I lost everything in the fire and... You lost everything. Of course you'd say that. You've always had everything handed to you. It was always Ryan the golden child. Let's put him on a pedestal. Let's give him the family factory entirely. You'd never understand what it was like. That's not true. I've always supported you. I've always wanted you to succeed. Support? Is that what you call it? All of you treated me like trash, of course you had it coming. So, you decided to ruin our lives. To destroy everything our parents built. People died because of your actions, Scott. Scott's voice grew louder and more desperate. Amanda and everyone else was eagerly hoping he wouldn't hang up. I didn't know it would go that far. I just wanted you to feel what it was like to lose everything. He went quiet after that statement, but it spoke volumes. Well, you succeeded. But it's over now, Scott. I'm coming for you. And what do you plan to do? How will you find me? You're just as naive as ever, Ryan. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I looked at the officers who were tracking the call, and they nodded, indicating they had enough information to locate Scott. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity as the police mobilized to arrest him. I went along with them, eager to see how this would all unfold. Amanda stayed by my side, her presence a source of strength and comfort. We both knew that Scott's arrest wouldn't bring back those who had perished in the fire, nor would it undo the damage he had caused, but it was a step toward justice and healing. As the police closed in on Scott's location, I couldn't help but reflect on how everything had led to this moment. My brother's jealousy and rage had destroyed so much, but I was determined to rebuild, to honor the memory of those we'd lost, and to move forward. We barged into the house and caught an oblivious Scott in his living room. He was living in a penthouse in a corner of the city. I was horrified to witness his lavish lifestyle despite all the loss and suffering we'd endured. I stared at him in shock as he was handcuffed and taken away. The news of Scott's arrest spread quickly, and the community's reaction was mixed. Some felt a sense of justice, while others were shocked that such betrayal could occur within a family. Scott was officially arrested and charged with manslaughter, conspiracy to commit arson, and fraud. The trial was a painful and public affair, reopening old wounds and exposing the depths of Scott's betrayal. Kevin detailed how Scott had orchestrated the sabotage, manipulating him into rigging the fire systems. After a tedious trial, Scott was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. It was a strange feeling to see my own brother behind bars, and all of our memories flashed to mind. But nothing could erase the factory fire. I turned to Amanda, grateful for her support and determination. In the months that followed, we established a foundation in memory of the workers who'd lost their lives. Dad started to show signs of recovery as well. Now that my name had been cleared and justice had been restored, I was determined to rebuild my life again after Scott took away everything. It was time for a new start.